recording.
Okay, good. So we're moving on to the fire sermon. And this is one of the more complicated as far as the intertextuality of reference, So I'm gonna read it to you and then we'll talk about it. The river's tent is broken. The last fingers of leaf clutch and sink into the wet bank. The wind crosses the brown land unheard. The nymphs are departed. Sweet Thames runs softly till I end my song. The river bears no empty bottles, sandwich papers, silk handkerchiefs, cardboard boxes, cigarette ends, or other testimony of summer nights. The nymphs are departed, and their friends, the loitering heirs of city directors, departed, have left no addresses. By the waters of Lemon, I sat down and wept. Sweet Thames, run softly till I end my song. Sweet Thames, run softly, for I speak not loud or long. But at my back in a cold blast, I hear the rattle of the bones and chuckle spread from ear to ear. So thus far, the fire sermon is about lust. And as Eliot points out, two of the major kind of religious figures in his mind are the Buddha and St. Augustine. The Buddha at the end of the fire sermon, Eliot quotes him. Well, he doesn't quote him, but the Buddhist sermon on fire, fire equals lust. And he's quoting St. Augustine to Carthage. Then I came, a cauldron of unholy loves sang it all about mine ears. And that's from the Confessions. So what Eliot is doing in the fire sermon is creating a collage of situations involving sexuality, situations involving especially women and sexuality, and especially victimized and abused and suffering women and sexuality, but also, sexual anxiety and sexual torment with regard to men. So the river's tent, this is about the Thames River, as you can tell, and he's quoting especially Edmund Spenser, the Renaissance poet, in Spenser's poem Prothalamion, which is a poem that precedes a marriage. Epithalamion is a poem that's celebrating the marriage, but a prothalamium comes in before a marriage. And Sweet Thames, run softly till I end my song. Sweet Thames, run softly, for I speak not loud or long. That's quoted from Edmund Spenser. Spenser, as you know, wrote The Faerie Queene. So he's, sort of, excuse me, a contemporary of Shakespeare and Marlowe and so on. But then Eliot is changing that out, as he so often does, and degrading it, purposefully degrading it. At my back in a cold blast, I hear the rattle of the bones and chuckle spread from ear to ear. That's also quoting Andrew Marvell's 17th century poem, To His Coy Mistress. And the original lines are Time's winged chariot hurrying near. And yonder all about us lie deserts of vast eternity. So Marlowe's poem is a carpe diem poem. Come, lady, while it's time, let's make love with each other. But Eliot is, as I say, purposely degrading that, dragging it down into the mud of the casual sexual encounters by the banks of the Thames River. Probably it was Dick Barnes who pointed out that silk handkerchiefs used to be used as rubbers. So, it's like this is about casual encounters between the loitering ears of city directors, sort of think about, he who shall not be named and his sons, and the nymphs, the girls who go down with them by the city banks. Yeah, Leslie? Oh, I thought you were raising your hand.
Oh,
Yeah.
I was. I'm here now. I can lower my hand. Bing. It will do it. It's not lowering. Okay. So, another thing is, I think that water by the waters, the line by the waters of Leman, I sat down and wept.
Mhm.
I was looking at something, it's by the waters of Babylon.
Babylon. Yeah.
Yeah. But Leman can be a few different things. It's one of all, it's Lake Geneva. So
Mhm.
that's where he went for his treatment. And in that case, we could be thinking that he's the one who's sitting and weeping because he's in such chaotic turmoil. And also, Leman, since he likes to use, you know, multiple meanings of words, also means a young woman, a mistress.
Mhm.
And then,
Mhm.
you go from that into Andrew Marvell to his coy mistress and stuff. They're just, it's all,
Yeah, it's all woven together. It's so amazing. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, a lemon is a lover. Lemon. And Lausanne is not actually on Lake Geneva, but that's a good call too, thinking about, Yeah, I mean, Eliot's really written into this troubled marriage, this nervous breakdown, this really personal difficulty. So moving on a little bit farther, we have references to the Fisher King. Now, the Fisher King is a really important figure that Jesse Weston talks about in From Ritual to Romance. And the Fisher King is first mentioned here. Um, on a winter evening round behind the gas house, musing upon the king my brother's wreck and on the king my father's death before him. This is taken from The Tempest almost directly, but it also is referencing while I was fishing in the dull canal. So the Fisher King is a character from the Grail legends. The Fisher King is somebody who, let me see, I'm trying to remember this correctly. Um, this is embarrassing. I had it in my mind last night and then I forgot it. Sorry, I'm visiting family, and so I'm all caught up with like what's going on with them too. So it's hard to keep it all straight in my mind. I'll come back to the Fisher King. Okay. I'll come back to the Fisher King. But anyway, okay. Um, so we've got these references to kind of squalor and death and mourning, musing upon the king, my brother's wreck, white bodies naked on the low, damp ground, bones cast in a little low, dry garret, rattled by the rat's foot only year to year. And then it modulates into this kind of vaudeville song. But at my back, from time to time, I hear the sound of horns and motors, which shall bring Sweeney to Mrs. Porter in the spring. The moon shone bright on Mrs. Porter and on her daughter. They washed their feet in soda water. And this is a popular Australian song at the time. And then we have this beautiful, beautiful line from Verlaine, the French poet Paul Verlaine's sonnet on Parzival. Parzival, the one of the knights who was holy enough actually to get to the chapel perilous and behold the Holy Grail. Et oh, ces voix d'enfants chantant dans la coupole, which means, and oh, the children's voices singing at the Grail Chapel. Just beautiful, beautiful line. So there's this longing to escape this endless round of torment and this vision of something blessed and beautiful that's just beyond reach. But then that modulates into the Song of the Nightingale, the Song of Philomel, whose tongue was torn out after she was raped by her sister's husband. Twit, 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 jug, 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 so rudely forced. Turu. Turu is Tereus, the man who abused Philomela. But it's also the bird song, Turu, like that. And then Eliot evokes again Unreal City. Mr. Eugenides is trying to pick up me, you know? And then a great, great passage at the violet hour is a phrase from Sappho, the Greek poet. But it's this passage that also evokes Tiresias, Tiresias the seer, I Tiresias, though blind, throbbing between two lives. Oh, now I know why Tiresias was condemned to be a woman for 7 years and a man for 7 years, is that he beheld the coupling of snakes. So you got to watch out for beholding the coupling of snakes. I personally have seen the coupling of turtles, but I was not changed into a man. I, Tiresias, though blind, throbbing between two lives, old man with wrinkled female breast can see. And then you have this amazing passage, which is such brilliant, and I would say fun poetry, but about the totally meaningless sexual encounter between a young man, carbuncular, and a typist. The young man, carbuncular, arrives, a small house agent's clerk, with one bold stare, one of the low, and so snobby too, on whom assurance sits as a silk hat on a Bradford millionaire. The time is now propitious as he guesses, The meal is ended. She is bored and tired. This is iambic pentameter, very regular, very kind of a playful rhythm, but discussing this completely degraded, squalid seduction. Endeavors to engage her in caresses which still are unreproved if undesired. Flushed and decided, he assaults at once. Exploring hands encounter no defense. His vanity requires no response and makes a welcome of indifference. And then the tone changes, and you can hear the voice changing. And I, Tiresias, have foresuffered all and acted on this same divan or bed. I who have sat by thieves below the wall and walked among the lowest of the dead. So Tiresias, sitting by thieves below the wall, foretells the fall of Thebes, the fall of Oedipus. And as he walks among the lowest of the dead, that is involved in the Iliad and the prophecies. I'm sorry, the Odyssey and the prophecies for Ulysses. Um, bestows one final patronizing kiss and gropes his way, finding the stairs unlit. And then we're thinking, oh, this poor woman, this poor woman. But then we find out her response, well, now that's done, and I'm glad it's over. She's just as cold as the guy, right? When lovely woman stoops to folly and paces about her room again alone, she smooths her hair with automatic hand and puts a record on the gramophone. Yeah, Leslie.
Sorry for the disappearance. The car tow guy came. Um, I was thinking about the Tiresias and how well it seems like Eliot has experienced female and male
Mm,
roles and how well he presents both. As you said, a lot of his instances are of young women who are having sexual encounters which they may or may not have wanted to have,
mhm.
and but bringing in Tiresias to have the balanced experience of both genders is pretty cool.
Yeah, that's very cool. That's very cool. And then we get this short stanza, a vision of something very different. This music crept by me upon the waters is taken Ariel's song, The Tempest. That Ariel's song is the music that creeps by me on the waters. And along the strand up Queen Victoria Street, oh city, city, notice the capital C, the city of God, the city of man. I can sometimes hear beside a public bar in Lower Thames Street the pleasant whining of a mandolin and a clatter and a clutter from within, where fishmen lounge at noon, where the walls of Magnus Martyr hold inexplicable splendor of Ionian white and gold. So a vision of like natural life, purposeful work, community, people listening to music together in a bar, and then this beautiful church. So that's a very different kind of vision here, just briefly for a moment. And then we get the great short line sections of the Thames Maidens, taken from, of course, the Rhine Maidens in Wagner's Götterdämmerung. Okay, the Thames Maidens, these voices that come to us seemingly out of nowhere, telling, oh no, I'm sorry, that's a little bit later, but we get here, the river sweats, oil and tar, the barges drift with the turning tide, red sails wide to leeward, swing on the heavy spar. The barges wash drifting logs down Greenwich Reach, past the Isle of Dogs. Ray, way, la la, lea, wa la la, lea la la. That's the present time. The past time, Elizabeth and Leicester beating oars. The stern was formed, a gilded shell, red and gold. The brisk swell rippled both shores. Southwest wind carried downstream the peal of bells, white towers, wea la la, lea, wa la la, lea la la. Now, some critics have felt that Eliot is contrasting a debased present with a splendid past. Others have felt, well, no, Elizabeth and Leicester, that was the realm of realpolitik. That was a realm of great violence and suffering also. And so you can either see these as contrasting or as, in a sense, more of the same. Yeah, Brian.
I have a comment on the Wagner. Um, Eliot could have chosen the Rhine Maiden's song from Das Rheingold, which is a song of innocence. but this is from Götterdämmerung when they've lost the ring and they're begging Siegfried to hand it back. And if he doesn't, the world ends.
Oh man.
So
Yeah.
there's something going on in this that's not really harking back to a positive older
No,
time, but on a time reflecting great loss.
that's so cool. That is
Oh.
amazing. That adds a whole different feeling to it for me. Yeah, Leslie.
Um, Another thing is the pleasant whining of a mandolin. Since
Hmm.
I've been at home, I had time to spend looking at interesting things. And when Eliot was having his breakdown when he first went down to Margate, he spent all his time in the Nayland Rock Shelter playing the mandolin.
He did?
Yes,
Elliot played the mandolin.
he was sitting there in the rock shelter playing scales on a mandolin, probably driving people crazy.
Where did you find that out?
I was reading this interesting thing about the shelter that he went to and how they find it was falling apart and somebody set it on fire and so they rebuilt it and they made it a level 2 national monument or whatever, you know. Anyway, so I thought that was pretty interesting. And then the bit about Elizabeth and Lester,
Hmm.
I've always sort of wonder if she's not another one of the maidens because the Virgin Queen,
How to be a maiden.
well,
Yeah.
but yeah, except that she apparently had an affair with Lester
Uh-huh.
and that, you know, it's not entirely certain to me who was undone and was raising their knees in the in the narrow canoe. Maybe this is just another, she's another one of the Thames maidens.
Yeah.
You know, it could be, I mean, it's a golden barge and all of that, but
Hmm.
she's in a very precarious position
She
sexually.
certainly was. She certainly was, sure. Because in order to maintain power, she had to be the Virgin Queen. You know, if she had a husband, he would be the one in power, you know. Douglas, you're talking on the phone to somebody. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Then we get these again stories of women. One, two, three, trams and dusty trees. Highbury bore me. Richmond and Kew undid me. By Richmond, I raised my knees supine on the floor of a narrow canoe. Tied with Dante. My feet are at Moorgate, and my heart under my feet. After the event, he wept. He promised a new start. I made no comment. What should I resent? And then the most broken of them all on Margate Sands. I can connect nothing with nothing. The broken fingernails of dirty hands. My people, humble people who expect nothing. Lala. To Carthage then I came, burning, 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 burning. O Lord, thou pluckest me out. O Lord, thou pluckest, burning. So I think it's a great section, you know, as Leslie says, the evocation of all these women, all these women's lives, these women's situations, these women's brokenness, these women's victimization, but also essentially their inability to feel. What should I expect? My people, humble people who expect nothing. And then the section that Eliot cuts so much. I mean, luckily he was good at cutting. This was a long, long story of a shipwreck, you know, and he cut all of that. And we just have this little tiny short section, Phlebas the Phoenician, who was foretold by Madame Sosostris in the pack of cards, the tarot. Phlebas the Phoenician, and this is natural death. This is death without salvation, death as physical death, death related also to the drowned characters in The Tempest. And, you know, Phlebas the Phoenician, the fortnight dead, forgot the cry of the gulls and the deep sea swell and the prophet and lots. A current undersea picked his bones in whispers As he rose and fell, he passed the stages of his age and youth, entering the whirlpool. So just down, 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 down. Gentile or Jew, O you who turn the wheel and look to windward, consider Phoebus, who was once handsome and tall as you. It's a great section. Evocation of water that becomes so important in the final section, but evocation of, the death of a male figure to contrast or to counterbalance with the situations of women in the preceding section, fire and water, the fire sermon, death by water. So far, before we move on to what the thunder said and the end of the poem, anybody have comments or questions? Yeah, Deborah, you're mute.
Hi. I have a little question that's kind of a technical question about poetry in general, maybe. It's kind of something I'm ignorant about. I just noticed when lovely woman stoops to folly, that line. And I thought, God, that sounds really familiar.
Yes, it is.
Not because of personal behavior, but because, So I Googled it and it's from some really old poem, 1700 and something.
A
And
gold, yeah.
yeah. And it's like direct quote. So I'm wondering what's the kind of etiquette protocol for stealing lines? I know you can steal ideas and phrases and kind of finesse that, but that's like, is that kosher? What's the protocol?
Well, Eliot is stealing like crazy in this poem. Eliot, at one,
Yeah.
it says, bad poets borrow, good poets steal. He's stealing like crazy.
Uh,
I think probably, but the thing is, he's stealing things that people would recognize, and he's creating this
mhm,
multi-dimensional texture of
mhm.
quotations because he's believing that poetry needs to reflect, the mind of Europe over time, right? And also, of course, the mind of the Far East in some extent as well. But I think that probably now the etiquette would be a little different. I'm trying to think. Yeah, I think that people would probably be expected to somehow acknowledge that ceiling
Isn't
by
this
using, also sometimes Elliot uses quotation marks too,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
wouldn't this come under, we need a lawyer here, but wouldn't it come under fair use, I'm thinking? Because he's using it as uh, a in itself an object that's part of the poem. In other words, he's not expressing the same thing or going over the same territory as the poem itself. It's kind of a meta reference
yeah,
to a different time and a different location. It's kind of shorthand for a whole world in all of his references.
yeah.
So I think it's interesting. It would be interesting to know what the copyright laws were when Eliot wrote this, but I suspect they weren't very uptight about it, and he wouldn't have gotten sued. And plus, these people are dead, most of them.
Oh, that's a big boon. Yeah, that's true. I mean, but
They're
I
in the
was
public
actually thinking
domain.
of contemporary poetry too, because um, a lot of stuff rattles around in my head, and I write really bad poems. I probably fit in the
Hmm.
former definition of poets that you describe, and nothing is published. But I wrote one about my two grandchildren being born several years ago, and I reread it last night. And the end line is, they are given to us perfect. And I
That's
think that's from the Gold Cell or from Sharon Olds. I think I stole it. So of course, it's not a published poem, so who cares? But if it were, would, I have to say, thanks, Sharon Olds or something.
I don't think
Well,
so.
yeah.
I don't
Well,
think
yeah.
so.
I mean, Anne, you'd know. Have you ever come up against this?
Well, I'm trying to remember. I don't think I've ever quoted somebody directly, but probably if I have, I've either done it in italics or in quotation marks. I'm blanking on that right now, which is weird. Hey, half the time I'm blanking on like what is that poem, that I wrote? Because I've written hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of poems, and it all kind of gets jumbled in my mind, you know. Tony's raising his eyebrows. It's like, oh my God, dementia is setting in. What can I say?
No,
Like,
I mean that I find that we're Leslie wants to get in here, but I don't have that confusion with songs I've written
yeah,
because, and I wonder if it's because they have melodies.
yeah,
And
probably
so
so.
I
That's
wouldn't
different.
mix one up with another.
Probably so. I don't exactly mix them up. It's like sometimes, like for instance, there's one poem that I wrote, which is actually in two of my books because I forgot it was in one and I put it in another. And then later I'm like, oh my gosh, what have I done? And I looked in this later. But I'm probably the only person who ever, realized that. It's kind of embarrassing, but not so what. Yeah, Leslie.
Well, as far as songs go, Tony, how about Bob Dylan, who stole things from all sorts of poetry all the time and never acknowledged any of it? So, I
Yeah,
mean,
and there's some of them he stole the whole song and then he
yeah.
gets the writer's credit. Yeah, it's true.
What I wanted to say is regarding that line from When Lovely Woman Stoops to Folly, I really think this is a collage. And I think that while Eliot knew that some of his readers wouldn't be familiar what he was cutting and pasting, he assumed that the educated ones would and that they'd recognize that that's from The Vicar of Wakefield, and that there's this character in it, this young woman who is seduced by the squire, as many women were, and then she's left. And in the second part of what she says, the my only recourse is suicide.
Yeah,
And so
absolutely.
you're supposed to be feeling, here's this young woman who just with automatic hand sticks another song on the gramophone and says, I'm glad that's over,
Mhm.
compared to a different era in which if a woman fell like that, it wasn't just folly, it was her social death.
Yeah.
And the whole thing, I mean, the whole thing, if you went through and highlighted every line that comes from another poem or another reference, it does. It looks like it's cut and paste with his ironic switching over into that was then and this is now more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I guess, none of these people are so wealthy that litigation is an issue. I mean,
Yeah, I could do that for
They're all
real,
dead.
right?
It's the Dead Poets Society.
there you go. Yeah, yeah.
Buddha is suing him. Ha. Yeah. Yeah, Douglas.
I don't know. Did you guys already mention that he in the footnote he quotes the Vicar of Wakefield?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh,
Oh, I found last time I was trying to remember something I wanted to quote to you, and I found where I'd written it down. It's in my notes for Gerontian, if I can find that, because it's quite eloquent, I think. It's Eliot wrote a wonderful essay on Baudelaire, and he says this: he could not escape suffering, and he could not transcend it. But what he could do was to study his suffering. So, think about that with regard to the wasteland. He could not escape suffering and he could not transcend it. But what he could do was to study his suffering. And I think that's quite wonderful. And I think it's quite reflective of what he's doing here, you know. By the way, totally parenthetically, the writer that Eliot loved most of all, and he wrote a splendid long essay on him, was Dante, even more than Shakespeare, even more than anybody else. He loved Dante. And he identified really strongly with this passage through hell to purgatory, and eventually, at least with glimpses of paradise, if not existing in paradise, you know. Leslie, is your hand up because it won't come down or because it's up? You're mute. You're mute.
Okay. I don't want to do too much here, but I found that letter that he wrote about the mandolin. And it was sort of interesting because it talks about he was writing a lot of the wasteland while he was going through this big
Yeah.
crisis.
Yeah.
This letter to Sidney Schiff. And he said, I have done a rough draft of part three, but do not know whether it will do and must wait for Vivian's opinion as to whether it is printable. I have done this while sitting in a shelter on the front, as I am out all day except when taking a rest. But I have written only some 50 lines and have read nothing, literally. I sketched the people and practiced scales on the mandolin.
That is so trippy. I cannot imagine T.S. Eliot playing the mandolin. Just absolutely cannot imagine it. This sort of tall, gawky, very, very formal, super brilliant, pretty stiff guy sitting there playing the mandolin. That's really wonderful.
The reference to Vivian, I mean, he put a lot of faith in her
Yeah.
review, right?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Despite we went through this last time, but despite the fact that they seem to have been unhappy, it's not like he dismissed her as
No, absolutely.
meaningless or not insightful.
Apparently, he used so much of their personal relationship in writing The Wasteland that she had him remove a lot of it because it would be recognizable to their friends.
Oh,
Mhm. Mhm.
oh boy.
Complicated. Eliot is a really, really complicated poet and person. Um, and I mean, a lot of people these days really absolutely cannot stand the poetry of T.S. Eliot. But I still think he's just an amazing, amazing poet. I think he's one of the greatest poets.
What they don't they like about him?
Well, the same things you were talking about. He's super depressing. I mean, he's not always, later on, he's not super depressing. He is anti-Semitic. He's a cultural snob. He described himself as a royalist, a Tory, an Anglo-Catholic. I mean, it's like he's just not, he is so un-PC. He's like the opposite of PC. Um, yeah. He's just not, and then there are still people, obviously, who really love his poetry, who still study it and write about it. But, and here's the other thing. We'll get to this when we get to William Carlos Williams. Eliot was the cultural arbiter in the whole first half of the 20th century. Once he started publishing his essays, and the new criticism was all Eliotic. So many poets were writing poetry sort of imitating Eliot or ascribing to the values for poetry that Eliot put forth in his essays. He had a huge, huge influence on poetry, all the way up to really the time of the Beat poets, the time of the deliberate rebellion against Eliotic poetry with the Beats, and then after that. But here's a little deal, for instance, William Carlos Williams, and as I said, we'll get back to this. William Carlos Williams, Eliot drove him crazy because Eliot left the United States and went to England and felt that the United States was not fertile ground for art because it was new, it was crass, it was blah, blah, blah. We didn't have kings, we didn't have cathedrals, so on and so forth. Eliot became super, super famous, and he was listened to and he was read, and people, really revered him. Williams and some others, including Wallace Stevens and Alfred Stieglitz and Martha Graham and, various artists, were trying to get what they thought of as an American Renaissance going in the 1920s, and influenced earlier in the 19 teens by the Armory Show, bringing Cubism to the United States. And they were really trying to create a kind of art that would be deliberately grounded in Americanness, very much in a tradition of Walt Whitman. America is the fertile soil for our art. So Williams wrote again and again about Eliot and Eliot's betrayal and Eliot's this and Eliot's this. Here's what Eliot said about Williams, and I think I've told you this. William Carlos Williams, a poet of some local interest, perhaps.
My
That's it.
goodness.
That's it. Now, Williams, as we'll get back to, has been a huge, huge influence on the development of American poetry since his lifetime, since he died in the early 60s. And so many people, coming out of that tradition, not only the beat poets, but also Adrienne Rich, and therefore after her, the confessional poets, the feminist poets, and so on and so forth, were influenced by and heartened by, and sometimes loaned money by, published by, or let's say helped to get publication by William Carlos Williams. So he's been super, super important to the development of American poetry since his lifetime. So you can really kind of see, something like this. And obviously both strands continue to exist, but the influence, the predominance of influence has really shifted.
It's
So
it's interesting that art, which we think of it as just such an individual, personal endeavor, it does have these trends. I mean, I'm thinking of the Impressionists and how they were shunted aside as being
yeah,
incompetent by the classical painters. And then the Impressionists come along, and then we have the abstract expressionists and people rejecting them. But there are these whole movements. I mean, I guess this is, I'm not saying anything that isn't horrifyingly obvious, but the thing is that the fact that you have these whole schools that may be around for like 2 or 3 decades dictating how things are done, and yet your idea is that it's an individual art. Painting and poetry and music, it's all very individual. And yet,
yeah, sure. Well, and it has to do too with who can get published. For instance, when
well,
we all were
that's
coming
true.
up through school,
Right.
think about how many women writers we did not read.
Right.
Think about how impossible it was for African American writers to get published.
Right.
You got to create the publishing companies. Think about the fact that we did not read Chicana writers. We did not really read much in the way of Asian American writers. I mean, I had a great education in white male writers. I would have been able to name to you 5 women writers, starting with Sappho and coming up to Emily Dickinson, you know? And then I remember discovering in the 70s and the 80s and so on, all these women writers and women started to be able to get published. There were publishing houses that were created in order to publish women. There were groups like Cave Canem created in order to give community and support to African American poets. And then later Kundaman, which is for Asian American poets, you know? And so sure, it's not at all surprising that there are these kind of waves of who has access, who has voice, who has cultural power in a way, except that hardly any poets have cultural power anyway anymore.
It's happening right now in movies. The Hollywood is now, well, for for one thing, the dying of the neighborhood theater and the home viewing. That's one thing, and then another thing is Hollywood just seems to be remaking that. The big blockbusters are either cartoons or remaking of something. In other words, they're going with what works
Sure.
and just regurgitating it. And I guess that's the same thing that happened in poetry and music and other art forms. That once a trend starts and becomes successful, everybody wants to get on the bandwagon and like the British invasion in the 60s.
Yeah, I think that's true, but it's also true that we are all influenced by what's around us, you know? And that's not necessarily a bad thing, you know? I mean, for instance, when I started writing poetry, I started writing poetry in an age of confessional poetry. People like Sharon Olds and Anne Sexton and Robert Lowell, and Adrienne Rich less so, less exactly confessional, but feminist. And you can't help but be listening to who's doing work around you or whose work you can identify with, and so that shapes what you're doing. And then later there was a reaction against that. The formalist poets wanted to get back to using traditional forms, to writing a more kind of highly polished formalist poetry. And things come and go. And we exist in communities. I mean, there are very few even artists who are like all by themselves in the deep woods someplace doing something that nobody else knows about. That's very, very rare. We should move on, okay, so that we can
One
finish.
quick question about that. Are there contemporary poets that you're aware of and that are really reverting to form and rhyme and really strong rhyme patterns? And so, I mean, like you mentioned Sharon Olds, she's got a pretty funny book, a current book about, I think they're odes, aren't they?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
like odes to withered cleavage and stuff like that.
Okay.
But is there a movement, because like the whole eco poetry movement, which I know you're familiar with. I bought that book in Santa Fe, by the way.
Hey, thank you.
Yeah, it's right on the entry table
That's
in the
cool. I
bookstore
approve.
there. Yeah,
I
I was
approve.
like, oh, I know this lady.
Yeah.
I talked about it and tried to get other people to buy it. But yeah, I don't see a lot of rhyme. And I don't know if rhyme is considered pedestrian or childish or passé or what's the deal?
Not childish. There would be people who would consider it very conservative, a conservative way of thinking about poetry, perhaps a way of thinking about poetry as apart from, ordinary life. But sure, yeah, there are still poets who use rhyme. John Poach is a good example I can think of, or Bruce Bond, not only using rhyme, but kind of writing a more formalist type of poetry. Um, and I'm going to blank on other names, but yeah, sure, there are people who do that. And then there are people who move back and forth, people who can, oh, I'm really bad at names. And I'm thinking of somebody who writes wonderful sonnet sequences, you know, um, and I can't think of her name right now, but if I do, I'll let you know. But yeah,
Hirschfield? No.
no, not Jane
Uh,
Hirsch. No,
I know
no,
you got to move on, but on this same topic, songs still rhyme.
yeah,
Right.
There's
yeah,
never been a free verse fad in songwriting.
right, sure, yeah.
Mm.
I mean, look at Eliot, the way he can move into and out of rhyme.
Hmm.
It's just brilliant. To me, it keeps the act of reading him so alive, because it's like your feet are dancing, you
Hmm.
know, you're moving from one pattern to another pattern, and he can change the pacing so elegantly. I love these short line poems that we just looked at. They sound so different. The Peal of Bells, White Towers, bringing it down just to phrases and moving a poem just through phrases where you
Yeah.
have to kind of breathe after each one.
Deep sea swell, rose and
It's just
fell. Yeah.
gorgeous. It's just
Yeah.
gorgeous. But if he did that all the time, you'd be like, oh, Jesus, God, let's move on. You know, this is taking forever. But if he does it to slow you way down and to give you these fragments of things, to me, it's just deeply moving.
Mhm.
Eliot's poetry has great mouth feel. People talk about mouth feel, how some things that you read, they can be brilliant, but they don't feel good to say them. And if they feel good to say, then that's your pleasure in poetry. So let's move on, okay? What the
Thank
Thunder said is, I'm going to just say it, magnificent. It is evocative. It builds to a climax. I'm going to read it straight through. And it's the kind of thing where Eliot says, you know what it means before you know what it means. What the Thunder said. After the torchlight red on sweaty faces, after the frosty silence in the gardens, after the agony in stony places, the shouting and the crying, prison and palace, and reverberation of thunder of spring over distant mountains, he who was living is now dead. We who were living are now dying. with a little patience. Here is no water, but only rock, rock and no water, and the sandy road, the road winding above among the mountains, which are mountains of rock without water. If there were water, we should stop and drink. Amongst the rock, one cannot stop or think. Sweat is dry and feet are in the sand. If there were only water amongst the rock, dead mountain mouth of carious teeth that cannot spit. Here one can neither stand, nor lie, nor sit. There is not even silence in the mountains, but dry, sterile thunder without rain. There is not even solitude in the mountains, but red, sullen faces sneer and snarl from doors of mud-cracked houses. If there were water and no rock, if there were rock and also water, and water, a spring, a pool among the rock, if there were the sound of water only, not the cicada and dry grass singing, but sound of water over a rock, where the hermit thrush sings in the pine trees, drip, drop, drip, drop, 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 but there is no water. Who is the third who walks always beside you? When I count, there are only you and I together, but when I look ahead up the white road, there is always another one walking beside you, gliding wrapped in a brown mantle, hooded. I do not know whether a man or a woman, but who is that on the other side of you? What is that sound high in the air, murmur of maternal lamentation? Who are those hooded hordes swarming over endless plains, stumbling in cracked earth, ringed by the flat horizon only? What is the city over the mountains, cracks and reforms and bursts in the violent air, falling towers, Jerusalem, Athens, Alexandria, Vienna, London, unreal. A woman drew her long black hair out tight and fiddled whisper music on those strings, and bats with baby faces in the violet light whistled and beat their wings and crawled head downward down a blackened wall, and upside down in air were towers tolling reminiscent bells that kept the hours, and voices singing out of empty cisterns and exhausted wells. In this decayed hole among the mountains, in the faint moonlight, the grass is singing over the tumbled graves. About the chapel, there is the empty chapel, only the wind's home. It has no windows, and the door swings. Dry bones can harm no one. Only a cock stood on the roof tree. Cocorico, cocorico, in a flash of lightning, then a damp gust, bringing rain. Ganga was sunken, and the limp leaves waited for rain, while the black clouds gathered far distant over Himavant. The jungle crouched, humped in silence. Then spoke the thunder. Da, data, what have we given? My friend, blood shaking my heart, the awful daring of a moment's surrender, which an age of prudence can never retract. By this, and this only, we have existed, which is not to be found in our obituaries or in memories draped by the beneficent spider or under seals broken by the lean solicitor in our empty rooms. Da, Dayadvam. I have heard the key turn in the door once, and turn once only. We think of the key, each in his prison. Thinking of the key, each confirms a prison. Only at nightfall, ethereal rumors revive for a moment, a broken Coriolanus. Da, Damyata. The boat responded gaily to the hand expert with sail and oar. The sea was calm. Your heart would have responded gaily when invited, beating obedient to controlling hands. I sat upon the shore fishing with the arid plain behind me. Shall I at least set my lands in order? London Bridge is falling down, falling down, falling down. Pues ascose nel foco que li affina, quando fiam uti celidon. Oh, swallow, swallow. Le plans d'Aquitaine à la tour abolie. These fragments I have shored against my ruins. Why then I'll fit you, Hieronymus mad again. Data, Dayadvam, Damyata, Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. I actually think this is the poem that awakened my interest in yoga and Buddhism because of the word Shanti, which of course means the peace that passes understanding. So let's look at this poem. I mean, I think this is just amazing. This really takes us on the journey through the wasteland to the other side, and it enacts that wasteland with this brilliant, brilliant rhythms, this repetition. Repetition and variation are the keys to poetry. The mind needs repetition. It needs to be, reminded of the same thing over and over, but it needs change. And Eliot is using repetition just so brilliantly here. Here is no water, but only rock, rock and no water, and the sandy road, the road winding above the mountains, which are mountains of rock without water, and dragging us through this land where there is no water, and then hallucinating the sound of water. Drip, drop, drip, drop, 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 drop. But there is no water. And then the hallucination of the journey to Emmaus, where the apostles felt that Christ was walking beside them, the disciples on the road to Emmaus walking with Christ, unknown, but also apparently, oh gosh, somebody, I think it was on a journey to the South Pole, they felt convinced that somebody was walking beside them who wasn't really there. But I do not know whether a man or a woman. Who is that on the other side of you? A nightmare figure, a savior, a hallucination? What is it? And then this brilliant evocation of the war-torn land, echoing, daughters of Jerusalem, weep not for me, but for yourselves and your children. The destruction of Jerusalem in the Bible, murmur of maternal lamentation, and the devastation of World War I. Who are these hooded hordes swarming over endless plains, stumbling in cracked earth, ringed by the flat horizon only? The refugees, no man's land. And then the history of the cities that have risen and fallen. Jerusalem, Athens, Alexandria, Vienna, London, unreal. All of it there, not there. Unreal city, gone. And then the woman, Belladonna, the lady of situations, this is some situation. A woman drew her long black hair out tight and fiddled whisper music on these strings. And you've got this total sci-fi delirious atmosphere of upside down in air where towers tolling reminiscent bells, the bats, the bats beating their wings, crawling head downward down a blackened wall, just a nightmare scenario. That one really brilliant book about Eliot's poetry and about Eliot altogether is by Hugh Kenner. It's a book called T.S. Eliot, The Invisible Poet. And this is what he says about the Fisher King. He says, the quester arrived at the chapel perilous, had only to ask the meaning of the things that were shown to him. Until he asked their meaning, they have none. After he has asked, the king's wound is healed, and the waters commence again to flow. The past exists in fragments precisely because nobody cares what it meant. So the legend of the Fisher King is that there's this Fisher King who has been rendered impotent. And the quester for the chapel perilous comes across him And if the quester will ask him what's going on here, the Fisher King's power will be restored and the waters will again begin to flow. But if the quester does not ask, the situation will continue, you know? So we've got here arriving at the Chapel Perilous, but it's empty. At this telling, there is the empty chapel, only the wind's home. It has no windows, and the door swings. And yet, when the cock crows, that banishes the evil spirits. That's the coming of dawn. So the end of this poem, I think, is really equivocal. It doesn't have a happy ending, but we've gotten to a different place. And what the meaning of that place is as yet completely unknown. And then we've got this evocation. Remember, I said that Eliot studied Sanskrit and he studied Hindu and Buddhism really seriously for a couple of years while he was, college age. And he's here going all the way back to the beginnings of, excuse me, Aryan culture. Ganga was sunken. Then speaks the thunder, and the thunder has these great commands: give, sympathize, control, data, dayadvam, damyata. And then these short little poems expressing what Eliot means by give. What have we given? What have we given? Blood shaking my heart, the awful daring of a moment's surrender, which an age of prudence can never retract. By this and this only we have existed. So the surrender of the self in love, in compassion, in passion. This is the only thing that makes us exist, not memories draped by the beneficent spider, not our will and testament, not our obituary. What does he mean by sympathize? Now, a key can let you in, let you out, or a key can lock you in. And that's equivocal. I've heard the key turn in the door once and turn once only. We think of the key each in his prison. Thinking of the key each confirms a prison. So, sympathy, are we locked in? Will the key release us? And then one thing Eliot loved his entire life was sailing. He sailed as a young man. The family would spend summers at Gloucester. And there's a really beautiful picture of him as a kind of late teenager, on board a sailboat. Control. What does he mean by control? He means responsiveness. He means this kind of dance of the sailor sailing the boat, the sailor knowing how to sail so that the boat responds gaily to the hand expert with sail and oar. The sea was calm and your heart responds gaily when invited, being obedient to controlling hands. So it's like, who's controlling here? Both are controlling. Both, the beloved, the lover, the sea, the sailor, the boat. Really beautiful, short little image here of something that Eliot said always gave him joy to do or to think about. And then the Fisher King is still waiting. I sat upon the shores fishing with the airplane behind me. So at least the airplane is behind him now. Shall I at least set my lands in order? Which is, I think, pretty much what this poem has been doing, is setting his lands in order. And then, of course, talk about stealing. This last stanza is made of stolen lines. London Bridge is falling down, falling down, falling down. The children's song, Pues ascose nel foco que li affina, then I will dive back into the refining fire. This is taken from Dante. And now I really want to find the correct piece of paper, which is here. This is from Arnaud, from the Purgatorio. And it means this: I am Arnaud who weep and go singing. Well, no, I'm sorry. Yeah. Ah, damn it. No, forget it. That's elsewhere. I'm sorry, you guys. I'm less organized than I should be because, as I said, I'm having family. Then I will dive back into that refining fire. Okay. And then quoting Tennyson, oh, swallow, swallow, and quoting again, Le prince d'Aquitaine à la tour abolie. Nerval comes to the abolished tower, to the empty tower. The prince comes, nobody's there. These fragments I have shored against my ledge, my ruins. And then a revenge tragedy, kids' Spanish tragedy. And Geronimo, like all these characters in the 17th century dramas, they go crazy and they do things and they stomp on bodies and so on. And Geronimo, taking revenge, pretends, like Hamlet, to be mad. Why, then I'll fit you. Geronimo's mad again. Data daya damiata shanti shanti shanti. And the poem is over. Yeah, Leslie.
So, I found out something that I hadn't known before about Arnaud Daniel, who was the one who was being interviewed in the Rings of Fire, who was welcoming the
Yeah,
purification. So he was this Occitan troubadour who Dante praised as being the Milior Fabro.
yeah, yeah,
So that quote that Eliot is applying at the very beginning to
yeah,
Pound, I'm full circle now to
yeah,
find where he got that quote. And he liked him. The reason that Pound liked him was because he was known for his extreme obscurity of thought,
yeah, yeah,
extremely obscure. So
yeah,
um, I just thought that was sort of cute, a neat pattern to come back to the very, very beginning and to give some hints about what it was that Pound and Eliot had in common and what it was that Pound admired
yeah.
its poetry.
Yeah. Oh, I know why I have this. So this is Peter wrote this down for me. I know why I have this. Remember the book in which Gerontian is published is called Aravos Prek, which means pray for me. And we talked about that last time. But here are the lines from Arnaud, and I'm just going to read them in English because my pronunciation of Italian is pretty awful. I am Arnaud who weep and go singing. In my mind, I see the present folly, and I go rejoicing in the joy I hope for tomorrow. I pray you by that virtue which guides you to the summit of the stair, remember my pain in time. Aravos prec, I pray you, remember my pain in time. Then he plunged into the fire, which refines them. Beautiful, beautiful lines, but accepting the pain of cleansing fire. And then also, as Leslie says, the consanguinity between poets, Dante and Arnaud Daniel, Eliot and Pound. It's really beautiful. So any final questions or comments about The Wasteland?
I just was going to say one thing. I think that last part holds together really, really well compared to some of the other parts. And Eliot told Virginia Woolf that he wrote the whole last part in a trance.
Yeah. Well,
Just,
you can
just
tell. You can tell. Yeah. Yeah, that he's really broken through into something, through this incredible mental distress, but something just breaks free and comes out. Yeah. And he read it quickly, unlike some of the earlier sections that were put together over a much longer period of time. And this didn't need cutting. If you look at the facsimile wasteland, there's hardly any changes or cuts in this last section. Yeah. Any other comments? Okay. So I'm going to send you more poems. We're going to look at the Hollow Men and the Journey of the Magi and Marina for next time. Um, you probably know the Hollow Men, at least not with a bang but a whimper. This is the way the world ends, not with a bang but a whimper. Um, and the Journey of the Magi is really fascinating. The Hollow Men is pre-conversion. it's kind of a nadir, and we're going to spend less time on that. But the Journey of the Magi is a journey poem toward belief, toward conversion. And then Marina, in my opinion, is it's the single happiest poem that Eliot ever wrote. And it's also the single most gorgeous poem that he ever wrote. Oh, bye, Brian. Yeah. So we'll see you next time. I'll send them to you. Thanks, guys.